Welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about type, and data, which is the last two things we really need in order to have essentially everything we need to know about Haskell, except maybe for defining our own classes. Okay, so type, the word type defines a type name as an abbreviation for other names. So in the prelude appears this type string is equal to this list is a list of characters, and we can use the word string or the list of characters interchangeably. They mean the same thing. So this is something we can just use now together. So an example that we saw in class was the example of matrix and matrix multiplication. Is if we define the type of a matrix, which is a function from integer from int and int into integer, right? So that's a reasonable definition of a matrix. It takes two integers, the row and the column, and returns another integer here. And we can do matrix multiplication, then it goes from a matrix to a matrix to a matrix. Okay. So this type declaration saying it's a matrix to matrix makes it much easier to tell that it's doing the right thing. So it's just a multiplication takes two things of the same type and returns something else of the same type. If we didn't have this type in terms of matrix, Haskell might try and do the inferred type. So the inferred type of matrix multiplication is in fact this. So the inferred type of this is it says it takes one matrix. It takes a second matrix, and notice that the second index of the first matrix has to be the same as the first index of the second matrix. So in matrix they have to be the same size. And it returns a matrix. Okay, so you might look at this and say, well, it's a function of 4 arguments. And it indeed is, but it's not as clear to make sure it's the right answer to say it's of this type. So it's much more readable to put in this than it is to put in that. Okay, and now we can just write the definition of matrix multiplication. We can just copy the definition from Wikipedia, and we find this gives this as a matrix. The matrix multiplication of matrix M1 and M2 is a matrix, but a matrix is a function that given index I and j returns this value for that matrix at position ij. So that's how we're going to read this. Okay, so that's much more readable because we have it written in terms of matrices. But we can also parameterize types. We can have the type matrix T. For any type T is another type. So a matrix of type T is a function from int and int into type T. So now we might have a matrix multiplication. Now it has to take a matrix of type T and a matrix of the same type and return a matrix of the same type. So we're going to read that. And this is, so for all T, matrix of type T is another type. This type T has to be of the num type. So this is the similar syntax we saw before. Notice that the T has to be in the num class, and matrix T now is another type. And we can now say that we can now declare this one here as a particular type. It might be a matrix of type integer. Okay, so we might declare that. So we did that last time. All right. The other part we're going to do is data defines new data structures and a type. So in general, we have this new type data. So this one here is a type. So we have data, then a new type, and then we have all these constructors. So we have all this constructor C1, constructor 1 up to constructor n. Right, and defines new constructors. These T, I, J, these all T are all types. So these are all types. The constructors have dual roles. The constructors with arguments give functions that can construct a value of that type, and constructors no arguments are constants. And constructors can be used on the left-hand side for the type. Can be used for deconstructing the type, which are often called accessing the type in other languages. On the left side of the equality or in function definition. So we can use this type to deconstruct a type. So here's an example of a data type. F value is there are 4 constructors here. So this one here, and we can use this to either return something that's a boolean or a number or an integer or a list of characters or a missing value. So this is an example that we use when we might build a machine learning one that can read a CSV file, and we want to return we want to either recognize whether it's a boolean, and if it's a boolean we want to return an f value of this type. If it can be interpreted as an integer, maybe we want to return it as an integer. Otherwise, we might return it as a string, but sometimes it's missing, so we're going to return missing. So we're reading this. We can see there's a new type of f value and 4 new constructors: Boolean f, number f, string f, and missing f. These top 3 are functions, and this last one is a constant of the type. Okay. So data definitions can be recursive. So here's one. It's a binary search tree. So a binary search tree has 2 different things. So there's empty, which is the leaf of a binary search tree. So this is just empty. There's no binary search tree. Or it's of the form, this now is a constructor node, and it has 4 arguments. The first argument is an integer. The second argument is a string. The third argument is a binary search tree, and the fourth argument is a binary search tree. And the idea is it's saying, so binary search trees are useful for tree implementation of dictionaries. So this says we're going to map. This integer maps to this string, and this is the left tree. It's all the ones with the key. The integer key is less than the key, and this is all the ones greater than the key. Okay, so this defines a new type, and we can read it here as this type. And 2 new type BS tree, and 2 new constructors, empty and node. And it defines not only the constructors, but also define how to access them. Okay. So we can also parameterize them by type. So we don't need to do this for node and integer, but we can do it for an arbitrary type k. So k is the key type. So k is a type. But k as a type here has to be part of the BST tree. So all of the nodes have to have the same key type. And so this is going to be the type here. And all the values v have to have the type v. And so now this is the type. The type is now this whole thing, BS tree k of v. So when the third argument has to be the BST of the same key and value, and this is the BST tree of the same key and value. Okay, so k is a type, is the key type, and v is the value type. And so now this whole thing, BST kv, is another type. Okay, so it's the type, and for a particular type, it's a parameterized type, and we can instantiate it by giving k and v particular value. So in the one above here, k would be int, and v would be string. All right. So here's the same definition before. Binary search trees either empty or node, and it can be now used in the function to deconstruct the type. So here's an example of doing that. So what we're going to do is we're going to write down, here's how to convert a list to list. Takes a BST type, something of type BST tree of k and v, and it returns a list of pairs of key value pairs. So it's going to go from a tree into a list. Okay. So now we're going to, the normal way of doing that is we're going to define 2 lists. We have the 2 cases. There's 2 cases for a binary search tree. It's either empty or it's a node. If it's empty, we want to return the empty list. So if the tree is empty, we want to return the empty list. Otherwise, it's going to be from this form, the node, key, value, the left tree and the right tree. And to do that, I want to recursively make the left tree, I want to convert that to a list, because that's a binary search tree. Then I want to append the list that contains, the first element is this key, the particular key and the particular value, and then I want to append that to the right list, the to list of RT. So that's the right tree. Okay, so this is how we're going to convert a binary search tree into a list. And notice it's very common here. We're just going to do the case analysis. There are 2 types of binary search tree. It's either empty or it's of this form. And when we write it like that, it actually assigns key to the value of the key position, val to the second position, lt to the third argument, and rt to the fourth argument. Okay, so that's how we're going to do this. And we're going to play with this in class. Okay, a few other random things you might see when you look at existing code that are useful. There's a function composition of f of dot g of x. In mathematics is f of g of x. In Haskell, we're going to write it exactly the same way. F dot g of x is f of g of x. Now this is actually defining the dot as an infix function operator. So this is going to return dot. So this is actually defining this dot, this infix operator called dot. and we're just going to define the f of g of x. And now we're going to use dot a lot, particularly when we functions that take a function as an argument. For example, in a map or a filter, we can do maps and filters with this dot notation, and it's very useful for doing that. So sometimes you might say dot, and it's just a function that happens to be defined in a prelude, and you could just as well have defined it yourself. Okay, so it's just another function. Here's another particularly weird function. It's dollar. So a dollar $b is just a applied to b, which might seem weird. And so the reason we might do that is because f dollar g of x, if we do that, then the syntax of Haskell means we're going to apply g of x first, and then we're going to apply the dollar, and then we're going to apply x. So that means f of g of x. So in some sense here, this use of dollar in here means we just get rid of a few parentheses, right? So it means this means we're going to apply g of x first before we do apply f. Okay, and f dollar h dollar g of x means we're going to apply this one first, and then it turns out the dollar is right associative, so then we're going to apply this, and then we're going to apply that. So although there are lots of very weird things that might look like weird syntax, this is just built into the prelude. There's just this one line appears in the prelude for how to define what dollar means. And it's and all it does, it really changes our syntax of things. So for lots of languages, the syntax is important, but for Haskell, the syntax is something that people build up as useful abstractions. And one thing that's also useful that you might see, and in fact it was in the solution to the previous assignment, so I thought I'd better explain it. The expression, and then you use this keyword where, and then you can write a variable equals a value. And you can actually write lots of variables equals values. And this is just a syntactic abbreviation for this. This says we evaluate the value, we replace x with that value in the expression. But that's what this says. We evaluate the expression with x equals val. So you can write either of these two things. They mean exactly the same thing. This top one is often more readable than the bottom one, particularly when there are lots of things we're defining in here. Okay, so here's a funny function. We could write DHD of a list is head colon the list, and then we're going to deconstruct the list within this where statement. So the head becomes the head of the list, and then we're going to duplicate the head of the list. So that's how we're going to read that. So we're going to have this list. We're going to evaluate the where function. That's going to assign h to be the head of the list, because we're using colon is just another constructor, right? Just like we did before. It's just defined in the prelude as a constructor. And now we're going to assign the head of that to the list, and now we're just going to apply that to the list. And this is useful to keep programs simple, because often we can, if you have a big complicated expression, it's often better to write it once and write an equality there. Or it's also useful for in this cases when we want to do pattern matching on results. So we often use it when some function returns a pair of numbers, for example, a pair of values, and we want to be able to refer to each one of them. Okay, so there's a couple of useful syntaxes that we might see, and there's nothing, they're trying to make the program more readable. They're all things that could be done without them, but we're just trying to make programs a lot more readable, and that's a lot of what we're going to try and do. Okay, that's all for now, and I'll see you in class. Thank you.